a core of their political platform. It must be stopped, and it must be stopped, like I said, by any means necessary. So, at times throughout this discussion, you really get into the nitty-gritty of just how oppressed Jewish people were in Europe at this time, and it just sort of kind of broke my heart, and also made me just want to shout out and give all my love and solidarity to all my Jewish comrades out there and all of our ancestors in the past, Jewish or not, who have fought the anti-fascist and the communist struggle. I mean, it's really sort of inspiring and tragic all at the same time. But again, this is a great episode. I learned a lot, and you will learn a lot regardless of what your tendency on the left is. And like I said, my friends from Poles of the Round Table did a lot of hard work. So please enjoy the episode. Before we go to it, I do just want to reassert that we are having a new logo contest. We're going to pay money, and we're going to put a link of your choice in the show notes of every episode going forward if your logo is the one that we choose. So continue to submit logos for Rev Left Radio at therevolutionaryleft@gmail.com. Me and Dave will pick our favorite, and once we do, we'll announce it. We'll change our logo on all of our platforms, and we'll, send you over the money and find out what link you want to put in the show notes, whether that's a link to your artistic creations or a link to your social media page, whatever. We just want to make sure that you get credit going forward if we do pick your logo. So with all of that said, this is a 3-hour episode on Stalin from a Marxist-Leninist perspective. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you learn a lot.
Yeah, so I am Jeremy. I don't know what else to say about myself. I'm just me.
Beautiful.
No one's youer than you.
No one is youer than me. I don't know.
And I'm Justin.
And before we get into the questions, you guys want to say a little bit about Proles of the Round Table? It's become one of my personal go-to political podcasts, and I know there's increasing overlap between those who listen to Rev Left and those who listen to Proles of the Round Table. So before we get into the episode, you want to talk about that a little bit, what your approach is, anybody that hasn't heard of you, etc.?
Yeah, so we try to primarily focus on history. We do a little bit of current events if it's relevant to the topic, I suppose. But we also don't take ourselves too seriously. We try to make everything kind of like a discussion among friends rather than a lecture or anything of that nature. Also, we get stupid drunk sometimes. Alcohol is always involved. And so as we go along, we get more and more ridiculous, which makes for some quality comedy, sometimes intentional and sometimes not.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's Proles of the Round Table.
Oh, absolutely. I was talking to somebody on Twitter today who found your show through mine, and that was one of the things that I mentioned is I laugh and I learn every episode. And, that's kind of why I wanted to bring you on specifically for this episode. One, because I really respect the empirical, objective approach that you take to things. Like I say, I learn every episode because it's filled with statistics and lots of things I didn't know. I'll take stuff that I learned from Proles of the Round Table and then take it into my shows or my conversations with comrades, etc. But also a little bit of the I don't take myself too serious, I think is important for an episode like this, which, we'll be divisive among the left depending on what your position is. But again, the point of Rev Left Radio is to facilitate conversations among leftists. Justin and Jeremy are comrades of mine, friends of mine. I've met them before in person, and I'm going to meet them again for the Marxist Center conference in November. So yeah, I thought you would be the perfect guest to tackle this controversial episode.
And I'd like to point out, though, before we get started, that people keep asking us to talk about Stalin. We're as far as Proles of the Round Table goes, we're we don't want to do that. We don't want to get into that because it's such a minefield. But then Left Media Podcast is hey, you want to come and talk about the death of Stalin, the movie? And we're all right. And then you're hey, you want to come and talk about Stalin?
Yep.
All right, here we go.
We're the Stalin Podcast.
We're the Stalin Podcast now, yeah.
And that's exactly why, because I heard the episode with Left Media Pod talking about the death of Stalin, and it veered from film analysis to just sort of historical analysis, and I thought that was awesome, and I learned a lot there. So I was that's when the light bulb went off. Let's have them on and talk about this.
Cool.
So yeah, just a quick question though. You said that you're you're almost hesitant to touch the Stalin topic on your show, but certainly Pearls of the Round Table is pretty open about being a Marxist-Leninist show.
Yeah.
And also spicy, but...
I mean, it's not necessarily something that we never wanted to tackle.
Yeah.
It's something that we wanted to stave off for a while so as not to immediately come out the gate, alienating people.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of, we're not ashamed to talk about it. Clearly, we're here talking about it.
Right.
But yeah, we didn't, it's just like you said, it's a very divisive topic, and it's a lot, as you're going to find out over the course of this podcast. It's a huge endeavor. I spent the last month and a half researching and taking notes to prepare for this thing. So it was just something that we really, if we figured at some point we were going to tackle it, but just we didn't know it was going to be so soon.
Yeah.
So you'll go on Brett's show and do it instead of your own, I see.
Well, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Then you have plausible deniability, and we can just be like, we didn't even want to talk about this.
You made us.
With that wonderful segue, let's go ahead and let's get into it. First and foremost, I think it's best to maybe properly contextualize this overall discussion by doing away with any great man of history nonsense, while also putting Stalin in his proper place as a meaningful and often decisive historical figure. So what do bourgeois histories and approaches to Stalin get fundamentally wrong, and how do you as Marxist-Leninists think of Stalin as a revolutionary in the broadest sense?
Yeah, so I guess let's begin with a great man of history issue, because it doesn't work like that, right? Although he was a central sort of author of what became the Soviet Union and led it from a position of authority, he did not have unilateral power. People were in charge of various programs, operating independently, or at least not directly under his thumb. There were people who were able to criticize Stalin directly and indirectly throughout his career, without the fear that Stalin was going to murder them. This is sort of this, I don't know where this idea comes from, and we'll kind of touch on this as we go, but this is a large, massive nation of a variety of people that each had regional, leadership, and to say that Stalin did everything and therefore he's responsible for all the things, whether good or bad, is somewhat silly. But having said that, because this happened under his leadership, these things happened under his leadership, we have to discuss it in the context of, he at least had some sort of responsibility in some way, I suppose. But again, great man of history is a silly concept, and we need to get away from it.
Yeah, I would also like to bring up right-wing historian named Stephen Kotkin, who's, like I said, he's a right-winger, he's conservative. He had an important take, I think, on Stalin, and he talked about how when the Glasnost happened and the opening of the secret Soviet archives, bourgeois historians were foaming at the mouth, just so excited to dig into these, to unravel, the mysteries of Stalin and the Soviet Union. They thought...
The mythology.
Right. They thought that once they did this, that they would find, that all of the rhetoric of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie and imperialism and the betterment of the people, that it was all just rhetoric. And that behind closed doors, they'd, let their hair down and talk about, power, control, wealth, taking land for themselves, to further their goals or whatever. And the opposite happened. They unlocked these archives, they dug into them, they find all these private meetings that were recorded, all these letters that were sent from person to person, and discovered that the rhetoric that they used in public in speeches at the Central Committee was the exact same rhetoric that they used behind closed doors.
Yeah, and that's incredibly interesting, and sort of, I did look. I mean, whenever you Google Stalin, prepping for this episode, whenever you start searching stuff up, Kotkin's book comes up and his research comes up, and it was really interesting to kind of dive into some of that behind the scenes stuff, because, as you say, even as a sort of right wing bourgeois historian, he still dispels with some of the mythology about Stalin that people all over the political spectrum, even to this day, sort of parrot unthinkingly and uncritically. And as for the great man of history idea, I mean, certainly most people listening, if they're longtime listeners of this show, sort of understand why that's fallacious. But it's no accident that Stalin, Mao, Fidel, any any big leader of a movement is sort of the whole movement's reduced to that person. It serves a few interests. One, I mean, it plays into the dictatorship narrative, right? It's like one individual with all this power and there's no democracy, etc. But also, I think it takes the focus off the fact that behind every single one of these communist leaders, regardless of your feelings on them, were millions and millions of people who led it, who supported it, who undergirded it. There's no Stalin, there's no Mao, there's no Fidel without the people of those countries doing the movement work, standing up, defending those political projects, coming to the defense of them, etc. And so, this sort of great man of history theory also sort of blinds people to the fact that these were all mass proletarian movements, and leaders did emerge, of course, but
of course. And I think we should bring up the fact that when Stalin became the general secretary, and really through all of his life after that, the Soviet Union was still extremely rural. The technology level was low. I mean, the technology level in the world was low. So this idea that one human could just blink his eyes and all of a sudden people would start disappearing is absurd, because is absurd because it took sometimes months to get one letter from Moscow out to Kiev or something.
Right. Absolutely, yeah. Moving on a little bit, I think another good way to start this, we have a lot of starts here, is to offer up some criticism of Stalin. Because of the controversial nature of the topic, I think it's important to kind of show people that it's not just some obviously blind faith, it's not some great man of history, cult of personality thing we're dealing with here. So as Marxist, as materialist, and as strategic-minded radicals, with the benefit of hindsight, what are your primary criticisms of Stalin as a leader?
Okay, so we have three, I suppose, and I'm going to start with the one that is probably the most, shall we say, contentious issue with anarchists, which is the Spanish Civil War. And I'm going to come down sort of in the middle on this one. Anyway, I'll do some context first. So, first of all, we need to understand that this was not purely an anarchist revolution. Like, we need to establish that, first of all. There were several different groups involved on the side of what was essentially the Republican Spain versus the fascists. So there was the Popular Front, which was kind of a weird liberal left coalition. So you had everything from the POUM, which was like a Trotskyist, Bukharinist organization. You had liberals and progressives in there. You had pro-Soviet forces within the Popular Front, and then you had the CNT-FAI, which it was the bringing together of anarcho-communists, anarcho-syndicalists, and then labor union members. Mm-hmm. And then you also have the UGT, which was also union labor leaders with the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party. And then you had this Basque nationalist force. Anyway, my point is lots of different people formed a coalition. There were the international brigades. So the international brigades were made up of about 10,000 French, about 5,000 German and Austrian, about 3,300 Italians, and then about 1,000 each from the US, the UK, Poland, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Canada, and the USSR. So this is one of those things where people will say, oh, well, they desperately needed troops, and Stalin refused to send troops, and he didn't send a huge contingent, but he did send about 500 regular troops, and then in addition to those troops, he sent about a few hundred planes, a few hundred tanks, and then 1,000 or more, depends on who you ask, artillery emplacements. About 14,000 guns. He spent approximately 140,000 rubles on supporting the Spanish Civil War on the side of the Republicans. He sent people who were able to train in guerrilla warfare. He sent tactical leaders, a couple thousand of tactical leaders who were able to sort of guide people in how they went. One of the only reasons that the nationalists were not able to successfully get into Madrid was that Soviet planes came in and essentially bombed these nationalist positions. So he begins to back off in 1937. But what's happening in 1937 is that Japan is invading mainland China. In addition to that, Germany is annexing Austria in 1938. Border conflicts begin to occur between Japanese troops and Soviet troops on the China border, in Manchuria and elsewhere. And this goes on all the way through 1941. So there's, I suppose, two different ways you can look at this. One is he should have continued to support the Spanish anarchists and communists and liberals and whatever in the Spanish Republic, because that would have made it more likely that they would succeed, and therefore there would have been a counter to fascist Europe. The other way you can look at this is if he had continued to provide material support and weapons and money and all of this to that uprising, would he have then been able to, fight off the Nazis as effectively on the western edge, or the Japanese on the eastern? And I think either one of those is a big what if. I'm going to come down, I think, on the side of at least he could have continued to send material support, even if he couldn't send money or troops if he needed to pull those back. It's hard to say, though. I mean, what are your thoughts, Justin?
Just like you said, it's hard to say which side it would have come down on. And it could have been a bad decision. It might have been a bad decision. But I don't think it is the betrayal that it's framed to be, as if Stalin was maliciously trying to murder anarchists in the streets or whatever. That is patently false. And so I think that that's kind of the important thing to remember here. But certainly I think he probably should have kept supporting Spain.
Probably so.
I would just butt in here for a second to say, obviously we've done an entire episode on the Spanish Civil War. I kind of give sort of passionate voice to my critiques of not only Stalin, but then you don't want to put it down to one person. Moscow's sort of approach with material benefits, but also I don't think you can ignore the fact that there was sort of heavy-handed Soviet apparatchiks who operated in the Spanish Civil War and who ended up actually, putting Marxists and POUM and anarchists against the wall. There was that heavy-handedness that I don't think can be denied on that front.
Sure. Yeah, the NKVD was certainly doing some shady stuff. Like they trained about 10,000 or 12,000 troops in guerrilla warfare. So great, that was a good thing. But they were also murdering anti-Soviet communists in the background as well.
There was also a plot within the NKVD, which we will touch on later when we get to the purges.
Yeah.
So at that exact time, in which the leadership of the NKVD was essentially trying to undermine the power of the Communist Party.
Yeah. So it's complicated, is what we'll say now, and we'll get to what was happening then. Yeah, because again, there's nothing that says that Stalin was like, kill this guy. It may have just been the NKVD acting on their own. Okay. But who knows? Who knows?
What's the next critique?
Yeah,
okay, so the next critique is, I'm going to say, probably the forced relocation of tens of thousands of Soviet citizens. This is another one of those big, what if,
Well, nothing happened without reason, right? There was no decision that was made without reason.
Right.
Those reasons may not have been the correct reasons, but there was nothing that was just like a blanket
Right. He wasn't just fucking with people to fuck with them. So they peaked in the lead up to World War II, in which basically, and again, it depends on who you ask, tens of thousands anyway, of ethnic Germans who were living in the Ukraine and Western Russia were basically relocated to Siberia or Irkutsk or places that were kind of out of the way, because Stalin's fear was that if the Nazis did get into the Ukraine or did get into Western Russia, that the ethnic Germans would suddenly side with the Nazis against the Soviet Union, which, valid or not, we don't know. I suppose it's better than putting them in concentration camps like FDR did, but it's a big like, ugh,
Right.
Cringy.
You're taking people based on their ethnic background and assuming what they're going to do in the future, rather than dealing with them on the basis of their class or their political leanings. So hard to say on that one, but I'm going to come down on the side of that was probably unnecessary, or at least could have been handled differently. And then the last one is I think the most obvious, the one that there's not much you can defend here, and that is the passage of Article 121, which criminalized specifically male homosexuality. So for background on this, because there tends to be this like retconning of history where we look back and we say, Lenin legalized homosexuality. Well, not really. I mean, he just did away with the Tsarist code of laws, which effectively made homosexuality legal, but it wasn't like his intent. He wasn't like, I believe in gay rights. The material conditions for them massively improved, obviously, but neither Lenin nor Stalin dedicated any time to discussing the concept of homosexuality at all. And so to either say that Lenin did it intentionally or Stalin hated gay people, he didn't have the power to do this on his own. This was something that was passed, through the Central Committee. But anyway, my point here is that this is obviously based on this fallacy that whatever homosexuality is degeneracy. It's a moral failing or some sort of bourgeois decadence or God knows